Imagine handing your enemy the one piece of technology that could beat you in the sky. Now imagine you did it on purpose, with a signature, a price tag, and a smile. In the summer of 1946, with the guns of the Second World War barely cold, Britain sold the Soviet Union its most advanced jet engine on Earth. Not a museum piece, not an obsolete relic. The real thing, fresh off the production line, capable of powering the next generation of fighter aircraft. Within 4 years, Soviet pilots would be climbing into cockpits powered by a direct copy of that very engine, hunting American airmen over the skies of Korea. And when those airmen radioed home describing what they were up against, nobody in Washington wanted to believe the answer. Because the fighter tearing through their formations was flying on British power. How does a nation sell away the thing that could destroy it? Who signed off on it? And why, decades later, do historians still argue about whether it was one of the most catastrophic miscalculations in Cold War history or something far stranger? Stay with me, because the real story is nothing like the version you've probably heard. To understand how something this strange could happen, you have to go back to a small workshop and a stubborn young officer named Frank Whittle. In the 1930s, Whittle believed the future of flight lay not in spinning propellers, but in raw jet thrust, an idea so unconventional that the Air Ministry nearly let it die on paper. Rolls-Royce, a company already legendary for building the Merlin engine that powered the Spitfire and the Hurricane through the Battle of Britain, took an interest, and by 1944 that interest had become the Welland, the first jet engine to fly in combat, fitted to the Gloucester Meteor. Britain had done what almost nobody else in the world had managed. It had built and flown a functioning military jet before the war even ended. That single fact would matter enormously in the years to come, because jet propulsion was about to become the currency of global power. Every air force on Earth wanted it, and only a handful of nations actually had it. Britain was one, the United States was another, and crucially the Soviet Union, despite fielding some of the finest piston engine fighters of the war, was not. Stalin's aircraft designers, men like Artem Mikoyan and Mikhail Gurevich, understood exactly what that gap meant. Without a reliable high-thrust jet engine, the Soviet Union could build the most brilliant airframe in the world, and it would still be outclassed the moment it left the runway. As 1945 turned to 1946, that gap was about to become the most urgent problem in Soviet aviation. And Britain, exhausted, broke, and desperate for trade, was about to hand them the answer. Because here is what almost nobody remembers about the end of the war. Victory did not bring prosperity. It brought collapse. Britain had spent itself into near ruin fighting for 6 years, and the bill came due the moment the fighting stopped. Factories that had built Spitfires and Lancasters around the clock suddenly had no orders. Hundreds of thousands of skilled workers faced unemployment. The government owed enormous debts to the United States, rationing was tightening rather than easing, and the newly elected Labour government under Clement Attlee was trying to build a national health service and a welfare state with an empty treasury. Every ministry in Whitehall was chasing the same desperate goal: exports at any cost, because exports meant hard currency, and hard currency meant survival. Meanwhile, the aircraft industry itself was staring at a strange and uncomfortable truth. The war had ended so suddenly that Britain now possessed jet engine technology more advanced than almost anything the world had ever produced, and precious few customers lining up to buy it, because most of the world's air forces were still flying propeller planes and didn't yet grasp what they were missing. Rolls-Royce needed buyers. The Treasury needed dollars, or failing that, any currency at all. And into that vacuum walked a Soviet trade delegation with an audacious request. They wanted engines, not blueprints, not theory. Actual working state-of-the-art jet engines, the Rolls-Royce Nene, one of the most powerful centrifugal flow turbojets on the planet. And astonishingly, someone in the British government was prepared to say yes. that someone was Sir Stafford Cripps, president of the Board of Trade, a man whose entire political instinct was built around one idea, that Britain's recovery depended on selling to anyone who would buy, regardless of ideology. Cripps pushed the sale forward, and it detonated a genuine political firestorm behind closed doors. Inside the Air Ministry and the military establishment, officers were horrified. Handing your most capable jet engine to a regime already being eyed with growing suspicion as the next great adversary seemed like lunacy on its face. Some officials argued the decision should never have reached the negotiating table at all, that certain technologies were simply too dangerous to sell, no matter how empty the Treasury's coffers were. Others pointed out, with a kind of grim realism, that Britain no longer had the luxury of drawing that line. The country was still feeding itself on ration books years after the fighting had ended, still borrowing dollars it could barely repay, and still watching its once mighty empire fracture piece by piece. Washington was even more alarmed than London's own generals, and American officials made their objections known through diplomatic channels, warning bluntly that this technology could come back to haunt the entire Western alliance in a future conflict nobody wanted to imagine just 5 years after the last one ended. Cripps and his allies in government pushed back against that argument with a rationale that sounded reasonable at the time. The engine wasn't some deeply buried state secret hidden behind barbed wire and armed guards. It was, in a very real sense, a commercial product, openly discussed and marketed in the aviation press of the day, already being built under license for air forces in the United States, Australia, Canada, and France, with the details of its basic design already circulating in engineering journals anyone could subscribe to. If the fundamental science was already public knowledge, the argument went, then refusing to sell the finished hardware achieved little beyond losing the sale to someone else down the line. British planners also believed something they considered a decisive safeguard, that the Soviet Union, however skilled its aircraft designers were, simply did not possess the industrial sophistication to reverse engineer the engine's most difficult component, the turbine blades, forged from an advanced nickel alloy called mnemonic that pushed the limits of contemporary metallurgy anywhere in the world. This wasn't idle wishful thinking. Mnemonic alloys were the product of years of specialized British metallurgical research, requiring precise control over exotic materials and manufacturing tolerances that few nations outside Britain and the United States had ever attempted at scale. If the Soviets couldn't replicate that alloy, the thinking went, they could buy every engine Rolls-Royce would sell them and still never manage to mass-produce a genuine domestic copy capable of powering a real air force. It was, in the minds of the men who approved it, a calculated bet rather than a reckless gamble, made by exhausted officials trying to keep a broke country afloat while extracting whatever advantage they could from a fading technological lead. And it was about to go catastrophically wrong in ways almost nobody in that room could have predicted. In 1947, the deal was finalized, and Rolls-Royce Nene engines, along with a smaller number of Derwent engines, began shipping east. Soviet engineers and officials toured British facilities, examined the hardware in detail, and negotiated for both the engines themselves and a license to study them further. For a nation that had been locked out of the front rank of jet propulsion, it was an almost unbelievable windfall, handed over not through espionage, not through a daring theft, but through an open commercial transaction with the full knowledge of the British government. Picture the scene for a moment. Soviet technical delegations, welcomed rather than smuggled in, walking through British engineering works, taking notes, asking questions, examining drawings that in any other decade would have been treated as closely guarded military secrets. There were no dead drops, no coded messages, no shadowy figures meeting on foggy bridges. Just paperwork, handshakes, and a shipping manifest. Soviet engineers took the Nene apart piece by piece once it arrived home, and their conclusion was blunt. British engineering was simply ahead of anything they had managed to produce domestically, by a margin that stunned even their own most confident designers. Rather than attempt to copy every detail slavishly, Soviet designers under Vladimir Klimov used the Nene as the technological foundation for a new engine, one that would be built with Soviet manufacturing methods and Soviet materials, designated the Klimov Ufai K1. And here is where the British calculation began to collapse, because Soviet metallurgists, working under enormous pressure and with resources few in the West appreciated, found their own solutions to the alloy problem British planners had assumed would stop them cold. Whatever shortcuts or substitutions Soviet industry used to match the performance of mnemonic, they worked well enough for the purpose at hand. The VK1 wasn't a perfect copy of the Nene. In some ways, it didn't need to be. It only needed to be good enough, reliable enough, and buildable at scale, and Soviet industry, driven by the full weight of state priority and wartime-style urgency even in peacetime, delivered exactly that within a remarkably short span of years. What makes this even more remarkable is the sheer speed of it. Nations rebuilding entire industrial sectors from the rubble of war typically measure this kind of technological leap in a decade or more. The Soviet Union managed it in a fraction of that time, converting a purchased Western engine into a domestically produced power plant fit for frontline service before the West had even fully processed what had been sold. The engine that resulted didn't sit in a laboratory. It went straight into one of the most formidable fighter designs the world had yet seen, a swept-wing interceptor already under development by Mikoyan and Gurevich, an aircraft that would become known to the world as the MiG-15. And here is the detail that should stop you cold. Design work on what became the VK1 was already underway in Soviet bureaus even before the British Nene engines arrived for study, meaning the sale didn't hand Stalin's engineers an idea out of nowhere. What it handed them was a fully developed, thoroughly tested, extraordinarily reliable Western power plant they could fly in their prototypes immediately, while their own domestic engine matured in parallel. In aviation, engine failure kills test programs, delays fighters by years, and sometimes kills the pilots testing them. By flying early MiG-15 prototypes on genuine Rolls-Royce hardware, Soviet designers eliminated one of the single greatest risks in developing a new combat aircraft, and they did it using an engine the British government had personally approved for sale. The MiG-15 entered service at the end of the decade, and almost nobody in the West understood what they were about to encounter. Then came Korea. On the morning of November 1st, 1950, American pilots flying propeller aircraft and early jets over the Yalu River encountered something that should not have existed according to every intelligence estimate available to them. A swept-wing Soviet interceptor that could outclimb, outturn, and outrun anything the United States had in theater. Panic rippled through Air Combat Command. The MiG-15, powered by the descendant of a British engine, was faster than the American F-80 Shooting Star, could fly higher than most American bombers could reach for safety, and carried cannon armament heavy enough to shred a B-29 Superfortress in a single pass. The United States scrambled to respond, rushing the F-86 Sabre into theater to restore parity, and the resulting duels over what pilots came to call MiG Alley would define the entire concept of jet versus jet combat for the rest of the century. But here is the detail that almost never makes it into the history books. When American intelligence officers finally pieced together exactly where the MiG-15's power plant had come from, the trail didn't lead to captured German technology, or Soviet industrial espionage, or a black market theft ring. It led back to a signed commercial agreement, approved in London 4 years earlier in the full light of day. And the secrets don't stop there. Very few people realize that the Nene wasn't treated as remotely secret even by Britain's closest allies, because it was, at the time, considered a commercial engine rather than a weapon of war marketed openly to foreign governments the way you might market an automobile engine to competing car manufacturers. Fewer still know that British officials reportedly held preliminary discussions about helping Argentina establish its own Nene production line, a plan that never materialized but reveals just how casually the engine's export was treated across the entire post-war aviation world. Almost nobody remembers that the Soviet Union never used the Nene itself in a genuine frontline fighter, choosing instead to fit the original British-built engines into attack aircraft while reserving the derivative VK-1 for the aircraft that actually mattered. Rarely discussed is the fact that Rolls-Royce itself had already begun moving past the Nene by the time of the sale, developing what would become the far more advanced Avon engine, meaning the British were, in their own minds, selling off yesterday's technology even as it became the backbone of tomorrow's most feared Soviet fighter. And perhaps the most unsettling detail of all is this: the British assumption that Soviet industry lacked the metallurgical sophistication to replicate the mnemonic turbine. Alloys wasn't a wild guess pulled from nowhere. It was the considered judgment of engineers who understood the material better than almost anyone alive. They were still wrong, and an entire generation of American pilots paid the price for that miscalculation in the skies over North Korea. The long shadow of this decision reaches far beyond one Cold War conflict. The MiG-15 and F-86 duels over Korea became the opening chapter of modern jet combat doctrine, shaping how air forces would train pilots, design fighters, and think about air superiority for decades afterward. Aerial combat tactics developed in the skies above the Yalu River influenced fighter design philosophy well into the jet age that followed, as air forces on both sides scrambled to learn lessons about swept wings, high-altitude performance, and cannon versus machine gun armament that had been settled, unexpectedly, in the crucible of a war nobody had fully anticipated fighting with this kind of hardware. The entire episode became a cautionary tale that governments still study today, a case study in how commercial technology transfer, however reasonable it looks on paper in a moment of economic desperation, can hand a rival the missing piece of a puzzle they could never have solved alone in time to matter. Modern export control regimes, the elaborate systems of licensing and restriction that now govern the sale of advanced military and dual-use technology across borders, trace part of their intellectual origin to exactly this kind of post-war miscalculation, where a government's short-term economic reasoning collided head-on with long-term strategic risk. Every time a modern debate erupts over whether to sell an advanced radar system, a semiconductor fabrication process, or an aircraft engine to a nation on the edge of alliance politics, the ghost of the Nene deal is somewhere in the room, even if nobody says its name. Surviving Nene engines and their Soviet derivatives now sit quietly in aviation museums on multiple continents, admired by enthusiasts who often have no idea of the geopolitical earthquake their components once triggered. Few visitors standing in front of a preserved MiG-15 in a museum hangar realize they are looking at the descendant of an engine sold by the very nation whose pilots that aircraft would later be built to shoot down. Rolls-Royce itself would go on to build some of the most successful jet engines in aviation history in the decades that followed. Powering everything from commercial airliners to the Concorde, its reputation for engineering excellence never diminished by the strange detour its 1946 export took through Moscow and into the cockpit of an adversary's fighter. But for the historians who study this era closely, the Nene sale remains something closer to a warning etched into the record, a reminder that technological advantage is rarely as durable as the nation holding it likes to believe, and that the line between a shrewd trade deal and a strategic catastrophe can be measured in nothing more than a handful of years. So the next time someone tells you that Cold War intelligence disasters always involve spies in trench coats and stolen blueprints smuggled across borders in the dead of night, remember the Nene. Sometimes the most consequential transfer of military power in modern history doesn't require a single spy at all. Sometimes it just requires an exhausted government, an empty treasury, and a signature on a perfectly legal contract. Britain didn't lose the Nene engine. Britain sold it willingly, openly, and in doing so handed an adversary the one thing money usually can't buy in war: time. What do you think? Was this a reasonable gamble by a broke and exhausted nation trying to survive the peace, or one of the most short-sighted decisions of the entire Cold War? Tell me in the comments, because I want to know where you land on this one. If this kind of forgotten history fascinates you the way it fascinates me, make sure you're subscribed, because the next story picks up right where this one leaves off, with a discovery buried for decades in the deserts of the American Southwest, and a decision that would once again prove that in war, the ending is never really the end.